just like make them disappear. Who are you?
Okay. All right. So sounds funny right here. All right. So where we're going, where we've been. So last week we talked about creation. We talked about how God did it, and we talked about how He manages it, right? And so now we're going to talk about the creation of man, and we'll talk a little bit about how that creation went amok. All right. So starting with a question. Or not.
It looks cool.
I know. I look all official. It ain't working. Yeah. All right, there we go. All right, so what do we mean when we say,
where's Casey?
when we talk about dignity, when we say there's a dignity for the human person, what does that word mean?
Does it relate to like the fact that we're created in the image and likeness of God?
Okay, so it's related to something about us being in the image and likeness of God. Yes. But what else does it? No, it works. What? But if I said to you, what does the word dignity mean? What would be your definition? So don't even attach it to human beings first. Let's talk about what dignity means just in general. Do animals have a dignity?
Yes.
Okay. Is it different than human dignity? Is it
Less than human.
okay? Less. All right. Why?
Is it directly related to the order of creation?
Yeah. So we've talked about it. We talked a little bit about last week about there being a hierarchy in creation. So it has something to do with the hierarchy of creation.
I'll say it's the degree to which the person or animal or thing reflects who God is.
Okay. So there's degrees of dignity related to how much we'll say how much being they have, how much they share in God's being. So in essence, what dignity is it's a bridge, right? It's a bridge between what a thing is and how that thing ought to be treated. Okay, so think of it as like a bridge word. So because human beings are made in the image and likeness of God, because they are eternal, right? They're more than material. They ought to be treated in a certain way, right? And that's what the church sort of insists upon when she talks about the dignity of the person. A couple of things to just sort of set the table, and then we'll talk. All right, so John Paul II, who was Father Karol Wojtyła, he thought that over the next 100 years, the greatest challenge facing the church would be the dignity of the human person. And he thought that the church's job would be over the next next century to defend the dignity of the human person. And so he set out to make that his mission. And it was a mission he carried through even when he was Pope. So he said, the call concerning the dignity of the human person is the most important voice of our age. Okay, and so he thought that the role of the Christian was to rediscover and make others discover the value of the human person. Okay, and you can see that as you move away from Christianity towards materialism, naturally the dignity of the human person sort of fades away, right? Because if there's no such thing as being made in the image of God, then people don't have a value beyond space they take up, or and if you look at even the 20th century ideologies, right, where the state or society takes precedence over the person, right? Because if the person is only going to live for 50, 60, 70 years, and you have something like the Third Reich that's supposed to last thousands of years, which is more valuable? But if you have a person who once they come into creation is going to last forever, and a state that's passing away, which has more value? All right, so you can see immediately how things can get thrown out when you forget this, right? And so much of the value, much of the fight that the church has to take on is discovering the dignity and the inviolable dignity of the human person. All right. So one of the ways, and it's a kind of a subtle way that this is under attack in our own age, is things like identity politics and intersectionality, things like that. And the reason why is because now a person doesn't become valuable because they've been made in the image of God. They're valuable because of, well, allegedly because of privilege. And then, then the person, they try to flip the value thing to how many victim points you have, right? Like that's at the heart of like intersectionality, right? But what it really is getting at is not at the person in and of himself and herself, but at some sort of accidental quality of the person that makes them somehow a victim of some sort. And so even that is an offense against the dignity of a person, right? Okay, so all of that being said, let's talk about dignity and at least get a proper understanding of it, all right? So we started with this sort of definition: God has imprinted his own image and likeness on man, Genesis 1:26, conferring upon him an incomparable dignity. But then Pope Pius XII says, true dignity and excellence in men resides in moral living, that is virtue. So he seemed to be implying that dignity is something that is either earned or at least something that you progress towards. So how do you explain the difference? So you sort of see what Pius XII seems to be saying, right? Is that actually there is something like, maybe there is something like a meritocracy or some sort of hierarchy in man based upon their moral living or their virtue. Is that true?
Yeah, that's definitely true. Like Mary has the highest dignity, and Saint Joseph's behind her,
right,
among humans. But I think it's still true that like every human has like a baseline dignity. You know, like they shouldn't be, murdered. Everyone kind of starts with some dignity, and that dignity can increase through their own decisions.
Yeah.
Or it could be
Right.
lost.
Well, yes.
Like I would say, like the highest quote, like it's the fullness of our dignity is achieved when we're living through virtue, because that is connecting us closer and closer to God.
Well, we're becoming more perfect,
Yeah.
right? We're becoming more perfect in the sense of we're becoming more of what we were made to be, right? So why did I make this like distinction? Why is this an important distinction between these two sort of dignities? What might be called ontological dignity, like just that basically adheres to us no matter what we do, what we say, it's just based on what we are, versus this sort of achieved dignity, which is based upon what we do and what we become. Why is this an important distinction?
It's not enough to recognize that we have a certain dignity that connects us to God, but we're obligated to grow further in it through virtue.
Yeah.
And also with that, there's a certain amount of dignity that a human can never lose, correct?
Right. Yeah. So there's this baseline dignity, which is the term he used, which is a good way to describe it. The problem is we always talk about the first, but never talk about the second. And you can't forget, like, it has to be both, right? Because otherwise, if we just talk about, well, a person has dignity, they can't lose it. Well, what's the motivation then to be holy? Or if we're all just sort of, if we all have some sort of dignity that we can't lose, and it's only about that, then the idea of striving to be excellent, which is kind of countercultural in a lot of sense. But there's another way too, in which you hear people talk about dying with dignity. What does it mean to die with dignity?
State of grace.
Yeah, that's certainly a state of grace would be important. But ultimately, dying with dignity means dying in a way that conforms you to Christ, right? And so if that's true, then if we really believe that the person has dignity, even in death and suffering, and in fact, it's not that they have dignity, it's that they're actually achieving more of it by suffering and suffering well, then our approach to people who are dying is certainly not to help kill them, right? We help them to suffer, we help them to suffer well, we try to alleviate their suffering, but nevertheless, the goal is to help them conform their lives to Christ, including in his death, right? Yes.
And also like with the Pope Pius quote, like it's a descriptor on the first, because how do you on the first one we have this incomparable dignity through God, but what does that specifically mean? It specifically means growing more like God through virtue.
Right. All right. So so in a certain sense, you can see you can see it almost analogously in things like even in stuff we use, right? So if this table was made out of gold, or let's just say it was made of like this really fine crystal, right? It's like this perfect table. Would I have dared like put something on top of it, right? Like in a certain sense, like to use this stacked tables may not be the brightest thing, but it's also like it's an offense against the dignity of tables, right? Tables are supposed to stand on their own. So the idea though is like you look at it and because that table is a more excellent table, you're more careful with it, right? Yes.
Is that like using that room versus this room?
Yes, it's exactly like that, right? Exactly like that. Because that room, because of the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, deserves to be treated differently than this room does. Okay, all right, so sort of to wrap up the discussion of dignity, and then we'll go into man himself. Of all visible creatures, Catechism says, of all visible creatures, only man is able to know and love his Creator. He is the only creature on earth that God has willed for its own sake. And he alone is called to share by knowledge and love in God's own life. It was for this end that he was created, and this is the fundamental reason for his dignity, right? So dignity rests not just made in the image of God, not just in achieving moral virtue and becoming more excellent, but also in our destination, right? And there's a great quote in one of C.S. Lewis's, I think it's like a sermon or something he gave in The Way to Glory. And he talks about the holiest thing you will see next to the Blessed Sacrament on this earth is your neighbor. Because they, in eternity, if you were to see them now, you'd be tempted to worship them, right? When they're filled with God's glory. Or think of them as something so unbelievably hideous if they weren't, right? And so ultimately our destination also is a fundamental reason for our dignity. Okay, all right, so let's talk about the human person. Man, though made of body and soul, is a unity. Through his very bodily condition, he sums up in himself the elements of the material world. All right, so remember we talked about a little bit last week about man being almost like this hybrid. It's sort of half spirit, half animal, and caught in both worlds, but yet not in pieces, but as a single unity. Through his very bodily condition, he sums up in himself the elements of the material world. Through him, they are thus brought to their highest perfection and can raise their voice in praise freely given to the Creator. So all creation worships God through man's voice, right? For this reason, man may not despise his bodily life. Rather, he is obliged to regard his body as good and to hold it in honor, since God has created it and will raise it up on the last day, right? So man can do things like the animals can do, but he can also do things like angels can do and perform abstract thought. And man is unique. It was what sort of we're getting at, is that he can do this strange mixture of those two things, right? Like only man can appreciate something that's beautiful, right? Angels can't appreciate the beautiful, right? Because it's not, they can't take it in the way that man can in and through the senses. It can't be felt the way beauty does, right? They can't experience conjugal love, another beautiful thing in which we image the Trinity. And so man is this sort of composite creature summing up all of creation in himself. is body and soul, right? You are your body, you are your soul. You will forever have have your soul in this body, okay? Even though in the resurrection your body will have been changed, it's still the same body, right? Okay, so the Catechism says the unity of soul and body is so profound that one has to consider the soul to be the form of the body, i.e., it is because of its spiritual soul that the body made of matter becomes a living human body. Spirit and matter in man are not two natures united, but rather their union forms a single nature. All right, so I want to unpack this just a little bit and talk about what we mean when we say that the soul is the form of the body. Does anyone know what that means?
I think you've often said it makes the body what it is.
Yeah, so
So-
the formal cause, the form is what makes a material thing what it is.
It like animates the body, so we can think like a dead person, like it still looks like a body, but it doesn't walk around and talk and everything, you know. And at the same time, like, you know, the body of Rob walks around and talks, you know, and then even though like the same atoms aren't always in it, you know, it's still like you can tell it's Rob, you know.
Yes. So the so we're constantly losing like skin cells, all this, like your physical body. I don't know how often the actual matter of it actually changes, but there's something constant in your body that makes it your body, right? And it's the soul is that sort of source of constancy. Yes.
Would like others say like this is dictated by like our brain, and that's why like cognitive disabled people or brain dead people are not seen as like human?
Well, I mean, yes, in a certain sense, like if you deny like the soul, people normally like start talking about the brain, right? Because the brain has this function of sort of integrating everything you're doing in your body. Like everything that happens in your body can be traced back to something in the brain, right? And so if people are materialists, that they think that's where it stops, right? And we'll talk about in just a little while how to sort of combat that thinking. But what I want to kind of get at here is just this idea of, you know, you guys seen movies where like people switch bodies, right? That couldn't happen, right? Because the person is a unity of body and soul, right? So you can't just take a soul and put it into another body. Because if you were to do that, if you were to take my soul and switch it with Keegan's, then my soul would form that body. This would be a weird thing, but suddenly I'd be there again. Like all you will have done is moved me over, and I would have the physical matter of Keegan's body, but it would still be organized as my body, because the soul is what organizes the body. So remember last week we talked about how for the soul to operate on the body, it has to be sort of sufficiently organized, right? Like we said, the brain had to be working. But so it has to be the kind of material in which a soul can operate, right? Okay, so once we understand that, we can begin to think about our origins, right? We can begin to think about, okay, where did Adam come from? Okay, and that's what I want to talk about for a couple of minutes, because there's some things that people say, like, oh, it could be this, and the church says, no, it can't be this. So we're going to talk about that, all right? Okay, so all the way back in the 7th century, Pope Pelagius said, I acknowledge that all men from Adam onward who have been born and who have died up to the end of the world will then rise again and stand before the judgment seat of Christ, together with Adam himself and his wife, who were not born of other parents, but were created, one from the earth and the other from the side of the man. All right, so we're gonna split them up, Adam and Eve, okay? And talk about where each one of them came from. Our first parents were formed immediately by God. This is the Council of Cologne in 1860. Therefore, we declare that the opinion of those who do not fear to assert that this human body, man, as regards his body, emerged finally from the spontaneous, continuous change of imperfect nature to the more perfect, is clearly opposed to sacred scripture and to the faith. All right, so what are they talking about? So what they're basically saying is that you cannot believe that what is called, I think it's called natural transformism is what people call it, where essentially there's this ape body that God infuses a soul into. And then that becomes the first human person. Okay. Why not? Besides just them authoritatively saying that. Why doesn't that work?
Animals have a different dignity than humans.
Yeah, so the dignity has everything, what they are has something to do with it. But think of what we just talked about with matter and form. Right? So in order for the human soul to go into a body, what kind of body does it have to be? It has to be a human body, right? It can't operate on any other kind of body. So for God to infuse a soul into an animal soul, I mean a human soul into an animal body can't be done. Not even God can do it, right? Because of the laws of nature, right? That the form, what makes the thing what it is. So immediately, what would happen if the soul went into an animal body?
It would be a human body.
It would be a human body, right? But the matter already exists, and so if it's not organized in such a way that the soul can operate, what happens? It wouldn't go in, right? It would either die or separate, whatever it is, right? So for this reason, the church rejects that. Okay, somewhere along the line, like the sort of natural evolutionary belief where you just kind of throw God in the equation by saying, oh, at some point he just infused the soul into the body. All right. So the church says, no, that can't be for sort of the understanding of matter and form. It won't work philosophically, and then it doesn't work according to scripture, right? What could work though? So where could the body have come from? What the church says is essentially what they call special transformism, which believes that either there was a body, but the body had to be changed before they could accept the soul. All right. Or what the church has always taught is that that Adam's body came from some non-organic matter. Okay. Those are the only two options. Either way, though, evolution doesn't work for the generation of the human body. Okay. It can't just be that all of a sudden the human body came along. I mean, the human soul was just infused into this. Even if it's somehow that this ape has advanced to a certain stage, because in order for it to be infused into the body, it would have already had to be a human body. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Don't understand?
Rob, did you say it came from a non-organic matter?
Yeah, the church is always
Like the clay of the earth, like when it says the clay of the earth, is that like,
So think of it in terms of like non-living, I should have said, not necessarily non-organic.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do all of the human organisms and skeletons that have been found, like how just the Neanderthals, where do those fit in?
Where do they fit? Well, you would just say that. Go ahead, finish.
Like we have the skeleton. So something I've been struggling with is trying to figure out. Like we have all of these different fossils of like here's like what the skull looked like. That's definitely not even close to an ape, but close to a human, but not human. And there are a bunch of them. Like where? How are those explained?
Yeah. So some of them, you would explain that they are human. It would just depend on which ones are you thinking about. Some of them are clearly also not human, and there was a like a special on I think it was on Nova or something, and it was about 10 or 15 years ago, and they had this anthropologist on, and he had found a skeleton of what he thought was an ape creature, but he wasn't sure if it was it was human, right? And so he's studying it, and he decides, well, this was clearly like an ancestor to the human. But the only problem is that the hip bone, they're not upright, And so he decides that what he's going to do because because somehow when the fossil was formed, it must have suffered some sort of violence that the hips got broken. He decided to rewire the hip thing so that it made it stand up straight. So, so the point is when you really start to look at some of these and the dating of them, and a lot of them are sort of contemporaneous with each other. So it really depends on which one you're looking at specifically. But there is a clear line between like what's an ape and what's a human once you really sort of look at it. And you look at the dating and you know, because if they're contemporaneous with each other, then they can't have evolved from each other, right? And so there's a lot of overlap when you look at them.
Are archaeologists like looking for like what they call a missing link or something?
Yeah.
So there's a bias going into it.
Yeah, or like that would make more sense where there's some that are not the same skeletal structure that we see today, but would still be human and have a soul, and then like on the other side of that would just not be.
Yeah, and the problem also with that is their ability to date things is really imprecise. Like right now, like even using the way they date things, like when you think you have something within 15 million years, and then another thing is within 15 million years, and they may or may not overlap. It's just the way they date things really makes it difficult. But the point is like all along they haven't found, like the only reason why they even posit that there's a missing link is because they're assuming what they're trying to prove. Which again goes back to what we talked last week about just sort of understanding the assumptions of what they're doing, and then taking it on those grounds. Okay, so Adam then, his body soul has to come directly from God. His body is either can be a transformed body from some other humanoid-like thing, or really from anything. I mean, it still requires a direct action of God, and so there's no reason again yet that we shouldn't just assume that when Scripture says slime or dust of the earth, that's not really what happened. Okay, there's no good reason not to accept that. Okay, so that's Adam's body. So Eve is a more definitive, a little more definitive than we have for Adam. So we're back to our favorite Pontifical Biblical Commission, 1909, where they ask a really long question and then give a one-word answer. So here's what they say. Is it possible, in particular, to call into question the literal and historical meaning where there is question of facts narrated in these same chapters that touch the foundation of Christian religion, such as, among others, the creation of all things that was accomplished by God at the beginning of time? So can we question whether everything was created by God? The special creation of man, so that special transformism that we talked about. The first formation of the first woman from the first man. The unity of the human race, the fall of first parents from that primitive state of innocence, and the promise of a future redeemer. And the answer is no. Okay, so where does Eve come from? It is a matter of faith, and it is, I would say, a matter to be divinely held or definitively held that Eve came from the side of Adam. Okay. So why does that matter? Why do we stick to that? Why does that matter?
She didn't co-evolve.
Yeah, so you would always, so what at the heart of evolution, right? And this is why we have to be really careful about accepting evolution, especially when it comes to man. At the heart of evolution is always inequality, right? That's why we started with talking about dignity. If two people are just a product of evolution, then they have different dignity. Right? That's just the way it goes. Like if it's up or down, they're not starting from the same point. All right. So not surprisingly, when you see evolution start to really take a foothold in the thoughts of people, you begin to see things like eugenics and Nazism and all of these things that all come from superior races, right? Because now they have science to back their lunacy, right? Like they're like, oh, science says that white people are more advanced than black people. Science says Germans are more advanced than Jews. Okay, and that will go on forever because there's no way to argue it, right? If evolution is true, that really is true. All right. there's no equality. And there's also no equality between men and women. All right? And that part is really important. And this is why ultimately I think evolution is, at least human evolution, is false, because of the conclusions that it runs us into an unbelievable ditch that destroys how people treat each other. Okay? And so the importance of Eve from the side of Adam is that they're equal dignity, right? They both, and they literally, right? So she comes out of his side, right? Not above him, not below him, right? She's genetically identical, right? Because scripture says everyone, including Eve, came from Adam. There's nothing unequal about them except the distinction between male and female, right? From the very beginning. And if man and woman were created that way, there's nothing that can make one lower than the other, all right? That's the only way it holds, is because if Eve evolved up from some other race of humanoids and they just happen to be able to breed somehow, then they're not equal, okay? All right, does that make sense? All right, but there's another kind of more important reason for the faith, and this is what the Council of Vienna said. And that in this assumed nature, the word of God willed the salvation of all, not only to be nailed to the cross and to die in it, but also, having already breathed forth his spirit, to permit his side to be pierced by a lance, so that from the outflowing of water and blood there might be formed the one immaculate and holy virginal mother church, the bride of Christ. As from the side of the first man in his sleep, Eve was fashioned as his wife, so that to the specific figure of the first and old Adam, who according to the apostles is a type of the one who was to come, the truth might correspond in our last Adam, that is to say, in Christ. So if you think that is symbolic, you also think it's symbolic that the bride of Christ came from his side. All right? And remember, we talked about God doesn't need symbols, right? He just makes what he wants to symbolize, right? We call them sacraments, right? So if you take that as a symbol, then you also have to take what it's pointing to as a symbol, right? And this is why, the other things like Jonah, right? A lot of their scholars say, oh, Jonah, that's not really a historical book. Well, if Jonah didn't really spend 3 days in the belly of the whale, then Jesus really didn't spend 3 days in the belly of the earth, like he said he did. Okay? So if you say that's symbolic, then you can turn around and go, well, Jesus is just talking symbolically. He was just hidden away. He didn't really die, or he rose in spirit. Okay? So this idea of typology, really important. All right? And so when God does things in the Old Testament, historical things, and then they're always pointing ahead to something really important, right? And so we don't take them symbolically. And so if you tug at that, if you tug at that sort of seamless garment, then you're going to lose the understanding that the church really was born from his side. All right, one other question that normally comes up once you sort of insist this, that Eve and Adam are the first two parents and only two humans at the time. Well, okay, how did we get from two to what we have now? What about incest? All right, so let's talk a little bit about that. Hence, so St. Augustine already thought of this question. Like a lot of smart people have thought about it. And so to sort of answer the question, you have to first ask, why is incest wrong? Without getting too. What makes incest wrong?
Say in part it's kind of like offensive to the family, like family members taking on different roles and like playing different parts is weird.
Okay, yeah, weird. Yes, weird. So, I mean, you were right around like sort of why it's wrong. Like it has everything to do, a lot of times people say, well, because, the kid will end up messed up, right? But that's like consequentialism, right? That because it's wrong, there's bad consequences to it. So the only reason why it's wrong is because God said so. All right. So you can't get a natural law argument for why incest is wrong. You can get one, and this is what St. Thomas is getting at. So you can make a natural law argument that a mother and a child, or a father and a child, is wrong, right? Because then, to Keegan's point, somebody can't be a father who is, in a certain sense, superior to the child and also equal as a husband. Okay. So up until the time of Noah, that's when God, by a positive divine law, said that sort of outlawed incest. All right. Before that, there was what we would call incest. So Cain and Abel breeded with their sisters, right? And nothing happened. And why didn't anything happen?
It's because they were like genetically perfect.
Yeah,
like,
because Adam and Eve were genetically perfect, right? And so let's just say that the next generation after the fall, maybe they have some sort of genetic defects, right? But the chances of them having the same, if it really is random mutation, chances of them having the same is minuscule, right? And so their children were also almost genetically perfect, right? And that would continue to go on for quite a while, right? So even from a genetic standpoint, people are like, well, you shouldn't do that. From a genetic standpoint, it still works. So, but I think it's worth having a discussion as to what ultimately why God says incest is wrong. And because, and this is what St. Augustine says, he says, well, part of the function of marriage is to unite two families, right? To bring them together, right? And so there's this positive idea of marriage bringing two families together. But it also protects within the family because it doesn't have brothers lusting after their sisters, right? Which is really important, right? So the fact that it's taboo, there's a good reason for that, all right? But it all stems to the fact of not having brothers lusting after their sisters. It has nothing to do with whether they're genetically related, like, you know, if Marcia and Greg Brady like lusted after each other, still wrong, even though they're not, you know, physically brother and sister, okay? So that's the idea. So the only way to get more is for Cain and Abel to marry their sisters, okay? It's not something we can just overlook, but there's a good explanation and a good reason for it, okay? There's really no other way for it to work anyway if you start with two people, two humans, okay? All right, any questions about the, you know, where Adam came from, Eve came from, where the next, you know, two generations come from? Is that all clear? How many of you guys have gotten questions like this before? Okay, good.
I know I have.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the human body, complementarity, and then we'll talk about the fall. Human body shares in the dignity and image of God. It is a human body precisely because it's animated by a spiritual soul, everything we just said. And it is the whole human person that is intended to become in the body of Christ, a temple of the Holy Spirit. Right? So again, the dignity of the body has to do with the fact that it's united to the soul, that the body does become a temple of the Holy Spirit. Yes, Steve?
Why does why does the human body image God, or why does God?
Why
Yes.
is it an image? Why does it share? Well, so the whole person is the image of God, right?
So I've heard that because of the intellect and will, right? You talked about that.
Yeah. So because of the intellect and will that operates in and through the body, but there's also, which is sort of gets to the next question of complementarity, right?
Okay.
So one of the ways in which, remember last week, what did we talk about? So last week when we talked about God the Father, how men in a unique way image God the Father because they're the sort of the initiator, and so in that way the body in and through the body reveals God the Father, right?
So it's precisely because of the soul acting on the body that both the body and the soul image.
Yeah. So think of it this way. This will hopefully help. How do you know? Not how do you know I have a soul? How do you know anything about my soul?
It's revealed through your
body, right? So if my soul is made in the image of God, then my body will too, right? Because it images God in and through the actions that the soul has to it.
Yeah.
Okay. But the other way is complementarity, right? And I mean, we don't need to talk a whole lot about this other than the fact that I want us to understand, like, complementarity isn't just, notice how they use masculine and feminine, isn't just like a matter of like plumbing. Like, it isn't like, okay, like men and women just bodily fit together. Like, literally they complement each other in every single way, right? So like we were talking about earlier today, like men have a unique way of having the virtue of courage, right? The way they practice courage is way different than the way a woman would practice courage, right? So a woman just as brave protecting her children, she'll do it in a different way. She won't necessarily go and initiate like against an invader. She would take her children and hide them behind her, right? Where the man in courage, he would go after an attacker, right? And those two ways together actually image courage completely, right? And the man learns how not to be rash in exercising courage by learning from his wife. And the wife learns when to step forward by seeing her husband act courageously, right? So that's why this complementarity, it's the full picture, right? And you know, I don't think I had a full appreciation of this until I was married for a while, where I began to see, wow, like I'm learning like what it means to be a full person by watching how my wife exercises virtue. And so, again, that's why, in a certain sense, like, not to be like Jerry Maguire-ish, but like woman really does complete man and man really does complete woman, in the sense of they learn fully like what it means to be human by watching each other and learning from each other, right? And you can think even just lots of ways, right? Like men tend to be a little more aggressive, women not as much. Usually the man will calm down a little bit from watching the woman respond to stuff. Okay, all right, so that's the idea. So we do complementarity sort of an injustice if we don't grasp that it's the full person and not just bodily that they complement each other. Okay. All right, I'm gonna skip this slide and then come right back to it because I don't like the order now that I'm talking about this. Can you prove we have a soul? Immaterial soul. Is that something you just have to believe, or is it something we can prove?
I assume it's more reasonable to try to prove it philosophically, but scientifically, there are a lot of gaps as far as like how the brain works, or what is assumed scientifically to be the brain working, and like us trying to replicate that or things like that. Like we don't understand that in through science, but I'm sure there's a better philosophical proof.
Okay. All right. So certainly there seems to be a gap between what we, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, science observes the natural world, and the soul is a supernatural thing.
Well, so careful with your, like, the way you use words. So science observes material things, right?
Yeah.
But the soul is immaterial. So what you're saying is true. Just make sure you say it precise enough. That,
okay. Yeah.
And so kind of what I'm saying is science, at least the degree to which it's like it could be assumed that there is some natural or material cause of what we would call to be the soul, but insofar as our science has the capability of observing, there is a there's an effect that we cannot prove a material cause to, suggesting a non-material cause.
okay, so what you just said is what St. Thomas said in less than a sentence. Your operation.
I'll take it. Like, I don't need to be as precise
you're
as
a
he
good
is.
company. You're just not as precise as him. But so what he really means, though, is okay. Abstract thought, right? Abstract thought. Where is, when I say to you, apple? Where is the apple that you're seeing? Like, where did that come from? Where did the apple that you saw in your mind when I said that word, you literally saw it? Where did that come from? Say that again?
Memory?
Yeah, but what triggered it? Like the idea of an apple, right? So your intellect went apple and called up the image, right? So where is that idea of apple? No, it's in your intellect, right? It's not something material, right? Because that apple doesn't exist in the real world, right? Like that's just the idea of the apple. right? And what if I said something like justice? Where does justice exist? Where does gratitude exist? If you open up my brain, can you find, justice in my brain? No, right? Okay, so abstract thought is something that's clearly not material, right? All right, so if we have this operation that doesn't depend on matter, so there's no, for abstract thought, it's totally in the intellect, right? If there's this operation that doesn't depend on the body, then I must have something that's above the body, okay? And in fact, because it doesn't depend on the body, I can also say that the soul is eternal, right? Because it's immaterial, it doesn't have parts, it can't degrade. So therefore, the soul is eternal. Yes.
So animals don't have
I guess
eternal
immortal is the
souls.
word, not eternal. So
Animals don't have immortal souls or whatever. Some philosophies talk about animals having souls. Is that just the same word talking about a material thing, or is there some sort of immaterial?
Yeah, so this would sort of go towards like the next slide, and just make sure I get back to the fall. But so all living things have a soul. So a soul is just this form that animates the living thing, right? And so, but animals have what's called a material soul because all of their operations depend upon having matter. And so when the matter ceases to exist, that form ceases to exist, right? Whereas we don't depend, our souls do not depend on matter for abstract thought, so they have some operation that doesn't depend on the body, and so therefore they're immortal. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's just like, would an animal brain and animal soul be synonymous in a sense, or like?
No, because in the proper sense, like the animal soul is something immaterial as well, right? So it's the form that makes the animal what it is.
It just depends on the
but it
material.
only can operate on material. So once the material ceases to exist, it also ceases to exist. So that's why you could never, like when you get to heaven, you're not going to see Rexy, right? Like Rexy's gone, sorry. But that's why, is because the moment that form separates from that body, that being no longer exists.
So
go ahead, Kevin.
And in the new heaven and new earth, are we going to have pets, or we don't know, or?
So St. Thomas said, I don't think we know for sure, but St. Thomas said that essentially you would have like a single dog that through its nature would encompass all dogs. I don't know how that, he's way smarter than I am.
Well, is it Kevin?
Yeah, Kevin. If Kevin, you really want a dog?
Kevin does not want a dog.
Yeah, dogs.
Nicole, can you get him a dog, please? He really wants a dog.
Just one.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a perfect dog that doesn't bite you, I think I'm good with it. But in this life, dogs are not my friends.
It would have to not shed too. I think Dominic is listening, so I won't tell you my thoughts on dogs, and hopefully he won't say anything. Because in my mind, there's no such thing as a perfect dog. But anyway, I digress. So that's the distinction. Nicole, you had asked this last week, or Kevin, one of you, through the chat, about the difference between soul and spirit. And I said it was sort of more like a distinction. And that's why, because only human beings have a spiritual soul, one that's capable of doing operations that involve intellect and will. Okay, and that's what, so sometimes the soul is distinguished from the spirit. St. Paul, for instance, prays that God may sanctify his people wholly with spirit and soul and body, kept sound and blameless at the Lord's coming. The church teaches that the distinction does not introduce a duality into the soul. Spirit signifies that from creation man is ordered to a supernatural end, and that his soul can gratuitously be raised beyond all it deserves to communion with God. All right. I'm going to go, since I am on a roll, and then we'll go back to the fall. Just a very quick thing about the origin of the human soul. Church teaches that every spiritual soul is created immediately by God. It's not produced by the parents, and also that it is immortal. It does not perish when it separates from the body at death, and it'll be reunited with the body at the final resurrection. That kind of summarizes a lot of what we talked about. The only thing is, at the moment of conception, a person exists, body and soul. Right? So the moment that the two gametes meet, God infuses a soul. Right? And that's why we're very very clear about the beginning of life, very clear about the sanctity of a woman's womb, right? God acts directly in a woman's womb. Sit on that for a little bit, especially as a dude, right? Like treat women a little differently, right? So naturally when you say this, people are immediately like, well, why is it that it appears that, say, people who are good at math also have children that are good at math, right? So something that has like abstract thought. Why is that, right? If the parents have nothing to do with the creation of the soul, why is that? And the answer, and this is sort of not a question that the church necessarily addresses, but is that the soul, how it operates depends upon the body. So the way a brain is organized can lend itself to mathematical thought, right? So things in certain regards come easier.
How did I end up as a poli-sci major then?
I don't know. I mean, it doesn't always have to be that way, right? It's just, I mean, it tends to be that way. It tends to be that intelligent parents have intelligent children, right? And that leads people to the false conclusion, well, it's all genetics, right? No, it's not necessarily all genetics, right? But it's also, there are genetic components in the way that the soul operates through the body.
So this is where we're different from, I just remember Anna talking about angels, that like angels at the beginning time, like they were created, stuff like that. Like it's not like every single soul that would exist and could ever exist was created.
No, so they're created at the moment of conception.
Okay.
It's not like this storehouse of souls where God goes, okay, number 17, whenever that comes up, you jump. So in that way, the church is not like Platonic.
But when we talk about parents co-creating with God in procreation, that is, the parents create the body and God infuses the soul?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's why we talk about it differently. We don't talk about it as reproduction, right? We talk about it procreation. As, like at the very beginning, what does Eve say? She's like, I got a man with the help of God. I got a child with the help of God.
Rob, I have a question about the idea of an apple thing. So,
okay,
like St. Thomas Aquinas talks about like phantasms. So is it like the image of the apple? Can that be physically in your brain, or that's like in your intellect?
Yes. So phantasms is just a fancy word for images, like images in your imagination. And so those things are in some respects, although we can't measure them in the way we do other things, are in some respects are material. So what's in your imagination is material. And your memory is material. And in that respect, like the higher animals have imaginations and memories, right? What differs in us is that animals can't call up memories the way we can, right? So if I say apple to a dog, they wouldn't have this image of an apple in their imagination, right? Unless for some reason, there was, like I repeatedly sort of somehow in their memory, they had, they had known the word apple or something. But the point is that the idea of apple wouldn't call up this image in their imagination the way it does in humans. And humans can do it like interiorly. I don't need someone to say apple. I could just sit here and start thinking about apples. Not that I do that much, but anyway. All right, so back to the fall. All right, and this is the last slide, but we can certainly we can dive kind of deeply into this. So man, tempted by the devil, let his trust in his creator die in his heart, and abusing his freedom, disobeyed God's command. This is what man's first sin consisted of. All subsequent sin would be disobedience toward God and lack of trust in his goodness. All right, so let's talk a little bit first about original sin, what it is, what it isn't. And then we can talk about some of the effects of the fall. All right. So the original sin, like sin in and of itself, is something that sits in the will, right? So the original sin is the first sin of Adam, where he disobeyed God. All right. His act then causes some fundamental change in all of his future offspring. All right. And the fundamental change, first and foremost, was the loss of sanctifying grace. Okay, so at the top of sort of like when we talk about I have original sin, that's the first thing, is that we lost. So Adam and Eve were created with sanctifying grace. We are not. Okay. Yes.
Would you say so? Protestants don't believe in original sin because they don't see that loss of grace.
Yes, some. I mean, it's a broad brush, right? So some of them don't. Most of them believe more like Luther in that it actually sanctifying grace isn't a thing. It's not something that, like, so God just sort of, if you make this act of faith, God just sort of looks at you as holy because he sees Christ. Whereas Catholic understanding is, oh no, you actually are holy because you have sanctifying grace. You have the life of God in your soul. So most of them believe that sort of the idea of like man is totally depraved, like the fall totally broke him and he could never. But some do believe that that because it becomes a sticky problem then, right? Some do believe that okay, the original sin didn't do anything. Like we just have to. There's just an act. It didn't do anything to us. It's just we just start. We just have to obey God to make up for it. So it's a little bit of both. All right. So the loss of sanctifying grace is the first thing. Okay. Now, if you stop and think about it, okay, that's really bad. But there's other effects of it because man might not know that they lost sanctifying grace, right? Like if you looked at yourself and all you didn't have was sanctifying grace, so you still had all the powers of your soul operated correctly, right? Your intellect wasn't darkened, your will wasn't weakened, your passions still, you still had control of your passions. You might go, okay, this is just what I am, right? But because they fell from such a height, God also bruised human nature, right? So that they would know, okay, something's wrong with me and I'm lacking something. And, oh, wait, I'm also lacking God, okay? So God didn't just leave us and just say, okay, sanctifying grace gone, just do your own thing. He actually, like, think about, like, Jacob is a great example of this, right? Jacob wrestles with the angel, right? And what happens? He's left with an injury, right? It's almost this image of original sin. So while we can get back sanctifying grace through baptism, the effects of original sin are still there. So our intellect is still darkened, will is still weakened, our passions are running all over the place. And so now it becomes arduous to put them back in order, right? It becomes work. And in fact, it becomes so much work that we need grace to get all the way there, right? So grace begins to heal those things. And then there's our cooperation with grace and all of those things. But fundamentally, the question always has to be, okay, there's something wrong with me. Something is not right, okay? So this is, C.S. Lewis says, okay, first you have to understand the bad news before you can understand the good news, right? And that's, the bad news is, okay, we're fundamentally broken. Not beyond repair, but there's something wrong, right? And that awareness of that is what makes us cry out to God, okay? All right, so there were other obvious effects too. So Adam and Eve were made as masters of creation. So simple things like, Adam named all the animals. What did that mean? If you name something, what does it mean? You know it, right? Like we talked about, like names and knowledge, right? So Adam knew all the things that existed, right? He knew about them. Okay, so he had all this infused knowledge about creation, right? Which meant that, lions being lions, he still knew how to avoid them, right? And not to mention, as the crown of creation, he also was able to command them. Okay, and you see residuals of this, right? Most animals can be domesticated, and that's why. It's residuals of the fall, right? It becomes hard to do for man to do it. They're unpredictable because all of nature rebelled against Adam when Adam rebelled against God. Okay, all right. So that's from the bottom. We'll work from the bottom up, right? And in obeying the serpent, Adam gave over the power of man to be the king of creation to the prince of this world. Yes, that's where Satan usurps man's power to rule the earth. All right. Go ahead, please.
How do we understand that everything else fell when Adam fell? When you're like thinking about it in terms of justice, and how like we can't have like this concrete thing, intellectual thing of justice.
Yeah. So why? So I think your question is more of like, okay, why? Because of Adam's actions, does everyone else and everything else sort of have to suffer, right? Is that what you're asking?
I guess like you can't have evidence for everything, because like how can you like look at justice and be like, no, like there is a difference in justice before and after?
Yeah, so there isn't necessarily a difference in what is just. It's simply what is achievable, right? So Adam could have, had he not fallen, he could have had a perfectly just society, right? Whereas now we could never achieve that because of the effects of original sin. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's this disconnect between Adam and creation, right? Then there's this disconnect between man and woman, right? So the relationship between man and woman, because what's the very first thing? First, Eve usurps the role of Adam, right? To start, like that's part of the problem, right? He was supposed to be head of her. He was supposed to protect her. So if you read the fall, right, what's really going on is she just takes the fruit, takes a bite, turns and gives it to him. What does that mean? He was there with her, right? So it's his inability, this is why we call it the sin of Adam, his inability to protect his bride that causes the fall, right? Because, and the reason why we begin to understand this, right, is because we flip it, that's how we know historically how to happen, to what Christ did, right? Christ did every one of those things. He died for his bride, right? On a tree. And so everything that Adam did, Christ undid, all right? So this fundamental break in the relationship between Adam and Eve happens, right? And so the first thing that happens is Eve, God looks at Adam and goes, "What did you do?" And what does Adam do? He blames Eve, right? He said, and God, the woman you put here gave me fruit to eat, right? So no responsibility, right? No responsibility for herself. So that there's this disconnect between the two of them, right? And God, even as one of the punishments, makes that permanent, right? He makes it so that men and women, the man will try to lord it over the woman, right? And the woman will always have this temptation to steal the masculinity of the man, right? Because of that. And so that, if he's going to lord over her, she can either be totally subservient or she can be his master. All right, so there's a two-way street, right? And both of them, right, have to labor, right? Man, work for man. In the garden, Adam still had to work, but work had a sweetness about it, right? And this, it was good. It felt good for Adam to work, right? But with the fall, and Adam losing his ability to really understand creation, how to master it, all those things, work becomes laborious, right? A woman having a child becomes labor, right? And not just the sweetness of having a child. Okay. But in the midst of all of that, never is there a moment where there's no mercy, right? Because what immediately God does says, all right, here's the effects of it. And the last effect he names is he tells them exactly what's going to happen, right? He tells the serpent that there will be enmity between you and the woman, and she will crush your head, and between her offspring and yours, right? So what is he promising, right? He's promising a redeemer, right? And not just a redeemer, but a redeemer and his mother. Okay. A new Adam and Eve, from which the new creation will start. Yes.
So God knew that Adam would fall.
Yes. But only because Adam did fall, right? So think about that for a second, like what I'm saying. Like God knows things that happen because they happen, right? So like God knew what Abraham would do because Abraham did it. Because sometimes people go, well, if God already knew what he was going to do, why did he have him do it? Well, because he knew what he was going to do because he had him do it, right? So he knew Adam was going to fall because Adam fell. But we go back to what we sort of talked about, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, about, but God only allows Adam to fall because something is incomplete in creation and something, he wants to give something better, and that's the most expedient way to do it. Right? And he tells them what the better thing is, right? The incarnation is the better thing, right? Like God coming to live among us and taking on our nature. Like that is far better than the fall. Right? That's a small, it's like the Easter exultant or whatever. Oh, happy fall that earned us such a redeemer, right? And so that idea then of God allowing it to happen so that something better could come along, that even applies to there. So providence even applies there. All right, yes, Key.
So, like, what would you say if someone asked, like, why couldn't God have just given us the Redeemer? Like, why couldn't he have given us the incarnation without the fall?
I mean, he certainly could have, but there would have been, so something would have been missing in the goodness of, it's like, so God creates to show all of his goodness, right? And one of the things probably missing would be mercy. Like we would have no knowledge of God's mercy, which is like, like if Jesus is, divine mercy, he tells Sister Faustina, like mercy is my most like powerful attribute, right? And so we wouldn't know about mercy unless we actually needed it. And I mean, there's all other kind of goods that come into the world because of that, right? And then, like a common question too is like, okay, well, why didn't he send the Redeemer like the next day? And it goes back to what I said earlier about we have to first sort of know that we need it before we're going to respond to it.
That's kind of reasoning is also what I've heard related to why God waited to create Eve as well. Like he needed Adam to know that something was missing.
Yes. Yeah, and certainly if you read it literally, that's exactly what he's saying, right? He's like, finally, like bone of my bone. Adam first has to learn I'm completely and totally different from all of these other things, and I'm alone, right? So this sort of solitude in creation for them to go. Then he goes, oh yeah, I'm alone, and that's not good.
Well, isn't it like how Genesis chapter, like the second chapter, treats it? Isn't it how it's written? It says that God had observed that man was alone, so like God had saw that Adam felt that way, right? Isn't that how it's?
Yeah, well, it's the only thing like all throughout the creation accounts, right? It's good, it's good, it's good, and then he says it's not good. The one thing he says not good is man is alone.
Original sin, it's hereditary in a sense.
Yes.
Not material.
No.
How does it become hereditary then? Is it an act of God that just...
Well, so remember, it's like, see it fundamentally as a lack of something that was a gift to begin with, okay. Right? So it's hereditary in the sense that we are now made without sanctifying grace.
Okay.
So in that sense, only in that sense is it genetic, right? And that's why the Jews circumcised. Like that's why they thought to enter the covenant you had to be circumcised, because they said it's procreation that makes original sin. Right? And so what they did is they, made the man suffer for it. Nice. Right, and that's why it prefigures baptism.
Okay.
Nice.
And so originally sanctifying grace is a gift to Adam and Eve.
Yes.
And they reject it.
Yes.
And so you're kind of saying that gift was a gift to man, not to Adam and Eve. And so when man rejects it, it's like rejected for all men? Or
yeah, so when Adam does that, the gift no longer is passed from generation to generation.
Okay.
He forfeited it from generation to generation until he gets to the Blessed Mother, right? And then got it. Like that's what the Immaculate Conception is. Essentially, Mary was made with sanctified grace in her soul.
Gotcha.
And all of her perfections come from that.
And so kind of like Adam in his authority as the father of
Yes.
man does that.
Yes.
So to kind of recap, it's sanctifying grace, its absence being passed. So the absence of sanctifying grace is what's passed down.
Yes.
And that absence is what causes original sin.
Yes. Yes.
It's not like
Because the minute, like Mary is made, right, and she has sanctifying grace in her soul from the moment of conception, she has no imperfections in her nature.
because God infused specifically sanctifying grace.
Yes. Right, and that's why Mary has to be immaculately conceived, because where does Jesus get his humanity from? Her, right? That's why everything stands like. That's why everything's centered. Every great thing you say about Mary always goes back to her role as the Mother of God. What else can I say about original sin and the fall? I don't know. What other questions are there?
So if, I mean, I don't have a list of all the gifts that God gives us, but if sanctifying grace was removed for all generations, is there another gift that could be removed forever?
Well, so Adam had other like preternatural gifts. Like one of them was like he was immortal, right? He couldn't die. And there's different kind of theories about the list of preternatural gifts. But for instance, he had like perfect discernment of spirits. And you see people now, some people have that gift, right? And that's why they call it like a preternatural gift. Because it was a gift that Adam had that God initially gave to mankind, and then certain people still get it. So things like that. So other than that's
like to be 900, like 60 plus years or something like that.
Yeah.
That's like what it says. Like, and then everyone tapers.
And isn't it because of the genetic thing that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's so. So man was meant to live like on forever, right?
I mean, like, and even like some scientists say like there shouldn't be any reason why we don't. Like some scientists think that they can fix aging so that like we are immortal.
Yeah, they're not going to fix that, but you also do see. So you see, like at a certain point, right? So God says one of the things with Noah, when he talks to Noah, is he says, man's not going to live like that any longer, right? The lifespan is going to be 80 years. And so everyone is genetically tied back to the 3 of Noah's sons. And so when God says that, there's obviously some sort of genetic defect that enters into mankind that shortens their life. Not that God had to use it that way, but it certainly, like genetically speaking, there's like people are like, oh, Methuselah lived 1,000 years. What? Like, it makes perfect sense, right? Like if you're starting with these genetically perfect people and and you really believe that, random mutations are what causes sicknesses and illnesses, well, it's going to take a long time for that to sort of play out.
Rob, what about other like generational sins or like sins whose effects can be passed down multiple generations? Like I think like Freemasonry or something like that. Are those passed down then? Like
yeah, so normally like Freemasonry, because there's a curse attached to it. So when a person enters the Freemasons, they essentially promise their children, and I think their children's children.
It's like 5 generations.
Yeah, I don't even know like how many generations it is, but you basically have to have a priest break the curse.
Oh,
so now I am not joking about this. So you absolutely, if you have Freemasonry in your family, you need to get with a priest and get the curse broken, because they've promised. So the father has authority. Like we talked a little bit about this. We talked about demonic authority, right? I have authority over my children just naturally, right? I can cede that authority over to demons, right?
So the curse thing is different than the lack of a gift. Is that what
Yeah,
you're
like
saying?
totally. They're not necessarily related, right?
Okay.
But it does, the generational thing like applies to it, right? Like that's just like it's sort of like an example of like things that are passed down generation, like the loss of sanctifying grace.
How do you start that conversation? Like
with what? How do you start what conversation?
Like, hey, like, how do you start that conversation? Like,
well, if any of you, seriously, like, if any of you have Freemasonry in your family, talk to me. I will get everything straightened out.
What is Freemasonry?
Okay, so Freemasonry is, yeah,
it's a society, but I didn't realize that. Like, where does the curse come into?
Yeah,
society?
it's essentially like it is a religious society that claims not to be a religion. It's essentially a secret society. The church has condemned it for 300 years.
Yeah. It's the most condemned thing ever.
It is one of the few things that just by joining, you're excommunicated. So it's one of the few things just by joining, mortal sin, gone. Like, so they have like quasi sacraments, which are clearly demonic because they're sort of ripoffs of, and it appeals to men, and normally appeals to men in kind of higher places. They know what they're doing. And they perform things like these quasi baptisms on their children. They promise, like as they rise in degree, they're given more of this sort of secret knowledge, and they make promises about their family and their family's family, like all of that, all the way down. And so, so what happens is you end up with some sort of like generational demon attached to a person. And there are a lot of people walking around with it. I mean, a friend of mine, the wife, found her father's. She knew her father was in the Freemasons, but she found his apron, and so I called a priest friend of mine, and the apron was in a Ziploc bag with a Bible in it, a Masonic Bible, and she found it in her mom's house, and she's like, "What do I do with this?" I was like, "Well, don't open the bag, don't touch it." And so I called a priest friend of mine, and he went over to her house, and they burned it while he was praying. As they take it out of the bag, blood comes all over the front of the apron. And then, for purposes of retaliation, the family had to pray for, I think, 10 days or something. If you, I don't want to freak anybody out, but it's a pretty serious thing. One of the signs of the curse is like sinus problems. So if you've got if you've got free,
that was fine, and then you said sinus problems.
yeah, if you've got Freemasons in your family, you've got sinus problems. They're probably related. Why the demon operates on that, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Really inconvenient.
No, but it's really easy to get it broken. Like you just go and any priest can do like Father Joshua has done it. I mean, I know he's done it multiple times. So you don't even need an exorcist to do it.
Do they use the Lycorium to do it, or is the Lycorium for like after or before?
I don't know. I've never actually seen them do it, so I don't know how they do it. So I mean, just to be like honest with you, like the devil is everywhere. Like if you're not like fully engaged in, especially now, like understanding like how he operates and how he gets hooks in people, and it's you just have to be aware. Like you got to be aware of stuff like this. Yes.
Can you talk about yoga?
Do I talk about yoga? Last time I talked about yoga in life, somebody got so mad at me, they started yelling at me. But I will certainly be willing to address any questions about yoga. So so yoga is another one of those no things, and basically because it's tied to Buddha.